right, chapter 4, what Caspian did there. The next morning, the Lord Byrne called his guest early, and after breakfast, he asked Caspian to order every man he had into full armor. And above all, he added, let everything be as trim and scoured as if it were the morning of the first battle in a great war between noble kings, with all the world looking on. This was done, and then in 3 boatloads, Caspian and his people, and Byrne with a few of his, put out for Narrow Haven. The king's flag flew at the stern of his boat, and his trumpeter was with him. And when they reached the jetty at Narrow Haven, Caspian found a considerable crowd assembled to meet them. This is what I sent word for last night, said Byrne. They are all friends of mine and honest people. And as soon as Caspian stepped out ashore, the crowd broke into hurrahs with shouts of Narnia, Narnia, long live the king! And at that moment, and this was also due to Byrne's messengers, bells began ringing from many parts of town. Then Caspian caused his banner to be advanced and his trumpet to be blown, and every man drew his sword and set his face into joyful sternness. And they marched up the street so that the street shook, and their armor shone, for it was a sunny morning, and so that one could hardly look at it steadily. At first, the only people who cheered were those who had been warned by Byrne's messenger, and who knew what was happening and wanted it to happen. But then all the children joined in because they liked a procession and had seen very few. And then all schoolboys joined in because they also liked processions, and they felt like the more noise and disturbance was less likely that they would have any school that morning. And then all the old women put their heads out the windows and began chattering and cheering because it was a king. And what is a governor compared with that? And all the young women joined in for the same reason, and because Caspian and Drinian and the rest were so handsome. And then all the young men came to see what the young women were looking at. And so by the time that Caspian reached the castle gates, nearly the whole town was shouting, where Gumpus sat in his council, muddling and messing with accounts and forms and rules and regulations. And he heard the noise. So here is the whole crowd coming up to the castle. Huxley, thank you. Huxley, come. Huxley, come. Thank you. At the castle gate, Caspian's trumpeter blew a blast and cried, open for the king of Narnia, come to visit his trusty and well-beloved servant, the governor of the Lone Isles. In these days, everything in the island was done in a slovenly, slouching manner. Only a little postern opened, and out came a tousled little fellow with a dirty old hat on his head instead of a helmet, and a rusty old pike in his hand. He blinked at the flashing figures before him and said, efficiency. He mumbled, which was his way of saying, you can't see his sufficiency. No interviews without appointments between 9 and 10 p.m. second Saturday of every month. Uncover before Narnia, you dog, thundered the Lord Byrne, and dealt him a rap to his gauntleted hand, which set his hat flying from his head. What's all that about? Asked the doorkeeper. But no one took any notice of him. 2 of Caspian's men stepped through the postern, and after some struggling with bolts and bars, for everything was rusty, flung wide both wings of the gate. Then the king and his followers strode into the courtyard. Here, a number of the governor's guards were lounging about, and several more, they were mostly wiping their mouths, came tumbling out of various doorways. Though their armor was in disgraceful condition, these were fellows who might have fought if they'd been led or had known what was happening. So this was a dangerous moment. Caspian gave them no time to think. Where is the captain? He asked. I am, more or less, if you know what I mean, said a languid and rather dandified young person without any armor at all. It is our wish, said Caspian, that our royal visitation to our realm of the Lone Island should, if possible, be an occasion of joy and not terror to our loyal subjects. If it were not for that, I should have something to say about the state of your men's armor and weapons. As it is, you are pardoned. command a cask of wine to be opened for your men to drink our health. But at noon tomorrow, I wish to see them here in this courtyard looking like men at arms and not like vagabonds. See to it on the pain of our extreme displeasure." The captain gaped, but Byrne immediately cried, "3 cheers for our king!" And the soldiers, who understood about the cask of wine, even if they understood nothing else, joined in. Caspian then ordered most of his own men to remain in the courtyard. He and Byrne and Drinian and 4 others went into the hall. Behind, at the table, at the far end, with various secretaries sat about his sufficiency, the governor of the Lone Islands, Gumpus. Gumpus was a bilious-looking man with hair that had once been red and now was mostly gray. He glanced up at the strangers entering and looked down at his paper, saying automatically, "No interviews without appointments except between 9 and 10 p.m. on second Saturdays." Caspian nodded to Byrne and then stood aside. Byrne and Drinian took a step forward and each one seized one end of the table. They lifted it and flung it to the other side of the hall, where it rolled over, scattering a cascade of letters and dossiers and inkpots and pens and sealing wax and documents. Then, not roughly, but firmly, as if their hands were pincers of steel, they plucked Gumpus out of the chair and deposited him, facing it, about 4 feet away. Here's them, upsetting Gumpus's table and moving him aside. Caspian at once sat down in the chair and laid his naked sword across his knees. "My lord," he said, fixing his eyes on Gumpus, "you have not given us quite the welcome we expected. We are the King of Narnia." "Nothing about it in the correspondence," said the governor. Nothing in the minutes. We have not been notified of any such thing. This is all irregular. Happy to consider any applications. And we come to inquire into your sufficiency's conduct of your office," continued Caspian. "There are 2 points especially on which I require an explanation. Firstly, I find no record that the tribute due from these islands to the crown of Narnia has been received for about 150 years. "That would be a question to raise before the council next month," said Gumpus. "If anyone moves to that commission of inquiry to be set up to report to me the financial history of the islands at the first meeting in the next year, why then, I also find it very clearly written into our laws," Caspian went on, "that if the tribute is not delivered, the whole debt has to be paid by the governor of the Lone Isles out of his private purse." At this, Gumpus began to pay real attention. "Oh, that is quite out of the question," he said. It's economically impossibility, or Majesty must be joking." Inside, he was wondering if there was any way to get rid of these unwelcome visitors. He had known that Caspian had only 1 ship, and 1 ship's company with him. He could have spoken soft words for a moment, hoped to have them all surrounded and killed during the night. But he had seen a ship of war sail down the straits yesterday and seen it signaling, as he supposed, to its consorts. He had not then known that it was a king's ship, for there was not wind enough to spread the flag out and make the golden lion visible, so he had waited for further developments. Now he imagined that Caspian had a whole fleet at Burnstead. It would never have occurred to Gumpus that anyone would walk into Narrow Haven to take the islands with less than 50 men, and it's certainly not at all the kind of thing he would imagine doing himself. "Secondly," said Caspian, "I want to know why you have permitted the abominable and unnatural traffic in slaves to grow here, contrary to the ancient custom and usage of our dominions." "Necessary, unavoidable," said his sufficiency, "an essential part of the economic development of the island. I assure you, our present burst of prosperity depends upon it." What need have you of slaves?" "For export, your Majesty. Sell them to the collarmen mostly. We have other markets. We are a great center of trade." "In other words," said Caspian, "you don't need them. Tell me what purpose they serve except to put money into the pockets such as Pug." "Oh, your Majesty's tender years," said Gumpus, with what was meant to be a fatherly smile. hardly make it possible that you should understand the economic problems involved. I have statistics, I have graphs, I have tender as my years may be, said Caspian. I believe I understand the slave trade from within quite as well as your sufficiency. I do not see that it brings the islands meat or bread or beer or wine or timber or cabbages or books or instruments of music or horses or armor or anything else worth having. But whether it does or not, it must be stopped. But that would be putting the clock back, gasped the governor. Have you no idea of progress, of development? I have seen them both in an egg, said Caspian. We call it going bad in Narnia. This trade must stop. I can take no responsibility for any such measure, said Gumpus. Very well then, answered Caspian. We relieve you of your office. My Lord Byrne, come here. And before Gumpus quite realized what was happening, Byrne was kneeling with his hands between the king's hands, and taking the oath to govern the lone islands in accordance with the old customs, rights, usage, and laws of Narnia. And Caspian said, I think that we've had enough of governors, and made Byrne a duke, the Duke of the Lone Isles. As for you, my lord, he said to Gumpus, I forgive you your debt of tribute, but before noon tomorrow you and yours must be out of the castle, which is now the Duke's residence. Look here, this is all very well, said one of the Gumpus's secretaries, but suppose all you gentlemen stop play acting and we do a little business. The question before us really is, said the Duke, whether you and the rest of the rabble will leave without a flogging or with one. You choose which you prefer. Then, when all had been pleasantly settled, Caspian ordered horses, of which there were few in the castle, though ill-groomed, and he and Byrne and Drinian and a few others rode out into the town and made for the slave market. It was a long, low building near the harbor, and the scene which they found going on was very much like any other auction. That is to say, there was a great crowd, and Pug on the platform was rowing out in a raucous voice, Now, gentlemen, lot 23, fine Terabithian agricultural laborers suitable for the mines or the galleys. Under 25 years of age, not a bad tooth in his head, good brawny feathers. Take off his shirt, Tax. Let the gentleman see. There's muscle for you. Look at his chest on him. 10 crescents from the gentleman in the corner. You must be joking, sir. 15, 18 has bidden for the lot 23. Any advance on 18? 21. Thank you, sir. 21 is bidden. But Pug stopped and gaped when he saw the mail-clad figures who had clanked up to the platform. On your knees, every man of you, to the King of Narnia, said the Duke. Everyone heard the horses jingling and stamping outside, and many heard some rumor in the landing of the events of the castle. Most obeyed. Those who did not were pulled up by their neighbors, and some cheered. Your life is forfeit, Pug, for laying hands on our royal person yesterday, said Caspian, but your ignorance is pardoned. The slave trade was forbidden in all our dominion quarters of an hour ago. I declare every slave in this market free. He held his hand up to check the cheering of the slaves and went on, Where are my friends? That dear little girl and that nice young gentleman, said Pug with an ingratiating smile. Well, they were snapped up at once. We're here, Caspian, called Lucy and Edmund together. At your service, sire, piped Reepy Cheep from another corner. They had all been sold, but the men who had bought them were staying to bid for other slaves, so they had not yet been taken away. The crowd parted to let the three of them out, and there was a great hand-clasping and greeting between them and Caspian. 2 merchant collarmen were once approached. The collarmen have dark faces and long beards. They wore flowing robes and orange-colored turbans, and they were wise and wealthy and courteous and cruel ancient people. They bowed most politely to Caspian and paid him long compliments, all about the fountains of prosperity, irrigating the gardens of prudence and virtue and things like that. But of course, what they wanted was the money that they had paid. That is only fair, sir, said Caspian. Every man who's bought a slave today must have his money back. Pug, bring out your takings to the last minim. A minim is a 40th part of a crescent. Does your majesty mean to beggar me? Whined Pug. You have lived on broken hearts all your life, said Caspian, and if you are beggared, it is better to be a beggar than a slave. But where is my other friend? Oh, him? Said Pug. Ugh, take him and welcome. Glad to have him off my hands. I've never seen such a drug in the market in all my born days. Priced him at 5 crescents in the end, and even so nobody'd have him. Threw him in free with the other lots, and still no one would take him. Wouldn't touch him, wouldn't look at him. Tax, bring out sulky. Thus Eustace was produced, and sulky he certainly looked. For though no one wanted to be sold as a slave, it is perhaps even more galling to be the sort of utility slave whom no one will buy. He walked up to Caspian and said, I see, as usual. Been enjoying yourself somewhere while the rest of us were prisoners. I suppose you haven't even found out about the British Council. Of course not. That night they had a great feast in the castle at Narrowhaven, and then, tomorrow is the beginning of our real adventures, said Reapy Cheep. But when he had made his bows to everyone and went to bed. But it could not really be tomorrow or anything like that, for now they were preparing to leave for all known lands, and sea made the fullest preparations had to be made. The Dawn Treader was emptied and drawn on land by 8 horses over rollers, and every bit of her was gone over by the most skilled shipwrights. She was launched again and victualled and watered as full as she could hold, that is to say, for 28 days. Even this, as Edmund noticed, was a disappointment. Only gave them about a fortnight's eastward sailing before they had to abandon their quest. While all this was done, Caspian missed no chance of questioning all the oldest sea captains whom he could find in Narrowhaven to learn if they had any knowledge or even any rumors of land further to the east. He poured out many a flagon of the castle ale to the weather-beaten men with short gray beards and clear blue eyes, and many a tall yarn he had heard in return. But those who seemed most truthful could tell of no lands beyond the lone island, and many thought that if you sailed too far east, you could come to the surges of the sea without lands that swirl perpetually around the rim of the world. And that, I reckon, is where your majesty's friends went to the bottom. The rest only had wild stories of islands inhabited by headless men, floating islands, waterspouts, and a fire that burned along the water. Only one, to Reapy Cheep's delight, said, and beyond that is Aslan's country. But that's beyond the edge of the world, and you can't get there. But then they questioned him, and he could only say that he'd heard that from his father. Byrne could only tell them that he had seen his 6 companions sail eastward, and nothing had ever been heard of them again. He said this, and he and Caspian were sitting down to the highest part of Arva, looking down the eastern ocean. I've often been up here of a morning, said the Duke, to see the sun come up out of the sea, and sometimes it looks as if it were only a couple miles away, and I've wondered about my friends, wondered what is really going on behind the horizon. Nothing, most likely, yet I'm always half ashamed that I stayed behind. But I wish your majesty wouldn't go. We may need your help here. That this closing the slave market might make for a new world. War with colormen is what I foresee. My liege, think again. I have an oath, my dear Lord Duke, said Caspian, and anyway, what could I say to Reapy Cheep?